I'm 17F and I want to start with saying there's even started and ended in a few months. Now that I'm graduated from high school, I feel it's better to talk about it. The situations couldn't be dealt with properly due my family not caring, and essentially thinking I was joking because apparently the ugly child can't ever be in a situation like this. The events were downplayed by my family. It started a month or two into my senior year. I had been camping out in my math class for lunch because the lunchroom was too loud. I honestly didn't even notice he had started doing it too until he started up a conversation with me. I played into the conversation, and we both talked about our parents and such. We also talked about the definition of the hood for some reason. We stopped talking once the bell rang for lunch to end, and everyone came filing in for the rest of class. After that we would talk from time to time, but that was all. From my side of things, I can't tell for the life of me when someone is flirting, so I couldn't tell that he had been flirting with me the entire time we talked. One day in particular he went down to get his lunch and I stayed in the classroom playing games on my phone. After he came back he sat down at his seat, then he got back up, walked over to me and put a popsicle on the table. He said he didn't see me eat ever, so he got me a popsicle. I thanked him, not thinking anything of it. Opened the popsicle, ate it, and threw the wrapper away. Later that day I was in my last class and heard people talking about how the guy I had been talking to had been caught playing with himself. While watching a video he recorded of a girl from our school, it went over my head because all I could think about is how I was hungry. Anyway, he didn't get in trouble for that incident. After that he stopped talking to me. I didn't know why, but all he would do was stare at me during class, when he saw me walking to my classes, when I would be talking to my friend, and when I would be eating food. When everyone I would be with my friend and he was around, she would get protective and glare at him and make gestures at him. He meanwhile would be staring at us with anger and jealousy. He would do this even when me and her got food as well. No matter who I was around, he would have that look, and it continued to go over my head. He started talking to me again when he eventually started to say small comments about my friend and how she was overprotective. He even asked me why she was overprotective. I simply said that I didn't know. After a while of his comments, and us just talking, it came to a boiling point. I was in class during lunch and he was in there too. He then started looking through people's bags, and me being non-confrontational did absolutely nothing, but I did take notes of which tables he went to for the bags. Once he was done and noticed me looking, he came up with something along the lines of, "Oh, my friend borrowed my headphones, I was just grabbing them." I just said okay. He then grabbed his bags, got up, threw away his food and walked only a foot out the door before turning around and walking up to me. I looked up at him confused and then he asked for a hug. I said sure, and he wrapped his arms around me and put his face in my hair. I just lightly patted his arm, not really knowing what to do. Then after the hug he simply left. The day after, I was called out of class and integrated by the principal about what happened in my class the day before, and I told him what happened and went on my way. Turns out the guy had stolen $200 from someone and now had to repay all the stolen money plus another $50. That day was the final day he talked to me. Then my friend joined the class for second semester and basically made sure he didn't try anything. The rest of the year was him basically gathering info on me through old friends and toxic ex-friends. He even became friends with people I was friends with. He managed to find this stuff out: the car I went to and from school, and my favorite fast food, my favorite drink, my phone number, where I like to hang out, what card games I like to play, what video games I played, etc. Yes, there is probably more, but I really don't want to know how much he knows about me. This type of stuff continued until I graduated. I finally feel good about him not being around, but there are a few times when my heart drops and I get anxiety because of him. My brother brought home friends and said some go to my old HS, and I refused to leave my room until they left because I was afraid he would be out in my living room. So I learned recently that he had actually gone to middle school with me but would kick out due to perverted behavior. Then he was kicked out of his high school and came back to my district. So Marcus, I pray we never meet again. This happened when I was around 12 years old. Me and my family lived in a small apartment, but it felt cozy to me and we knew some of our neighbors and would sometimes even invite them to our house. They were great people. At the time I used to sleep next to my brother's bed and felt safe with his presence, like nothing bad would happen to me. The only thing I can say was bad about the apartment was that our bedroom was next to the bedroom of our neighbor, which was a little higher than ours. If you wanted to see their room, you could do so by getting on top of a chair, while they could see almost our entire bedroom with no effort. Despite it being freaky, I didn't think much about it, since like I said, I had my brother sleeping in the same room and felt like nothing could go wrong. Oh, how innocent I was. The day everything started, I had barely finished my dinner and decided that I would go to sleep early, so my brother was not in the room at the moment. Everything seemed fine, until I woke up and saw something that still gives me chills to this day. What I saw was a silhouette of a person right next to the window, and while I could not see their face at all, I knew they were staring at me. I remember screaming as loud as I could and running desperately to the living room, where my mom was watching TV. I explained what happened to her, and she didn't seem bothered at all. She was like, "Oh, okay," and continued watching TV like nothing happened. A few days after that event I was feeling way better about it, but even then, I decided to keep the curtains closed, just in case. Until one day I woke up in the middle of the night and for some reason, had the idea of opening the curtains. And as you already expected, she was there staring at me once again, and like the first time, I couldn't see her face at all, just a black figure. I don't know how many times she did that, but for the following days I would wake up like 2 to 3 times every night, and while the curtains were always closed, I would have this feeling that she was there, watching me sleep. A few days later I decided to tell my parents everything, and that's when things get creepier. They said that right next to our apartment lived an elderly woman who was sick and had her son taking care of her. They said that they would leave to take out the trash, and she would sneak behind them and smile, while patiently waiting for them to turn around. I tried telling them how I felt paranoid she was always watching me, and they said something like, "She's a sick old lady. Scaring people is probably the only highlight of her week. Just ignore her and keep sleeping." While nowadays I don't care much about that, I remember being very angry with them. Why weren't they helping me? I did exactly as they said, and just ignored her every night, while keeping the curtains closed. It took some time, but I was finally starting to forget about the experience, until a few weeks later, that's when things took a turn for the worse. From my mother's perspective, our family was always different from others. My mom was the one working all day while my dad would be at home with us, so he would always bring me and my brother to school and then go pick us out when it ended. One day I was at school waiting for my dad to arrive when a friend came up to me and said she could bring me home with her dad's car. I completely forgot my father was coming to get me, so I said yes and went inside. When I got back home I knocked at the door, but other than my 2 dogs barking, there was no response. I started to get anxious, so I kept knocking over and over, until I heard a big sound coming from the old woman's apartment, and that's when I realized I had made a big mistake. As soon as I heard the sound I ran to the elevator and clicked the buttons as many times as I could. Our elevator had a window at the center, so I was terrified she would show up in it, but thankfully she didn't. After I left the building I decided to lay down on the street, trying to process what had happened, when my friend saw me and invited me to their house. I was watching cartoons while her dad was calling mine, explaining why I was not at school. When my dad came back, I ran to him and gave him a big hug while crying, and he said, "It's okay now." My brother's class usually ended 30 minutes after mine, so we had to go back to school and get him. The entire time I was expecting my father to scold me, but instead he was very calm and told me he was thinking of buying a cell phone, so I could message him if anything happened. After that experience I was even more terrified of the old woman, but kept the curtains closed like usual, and kind of got used to it. Eventually, we moved to a different house, and I never saw that woman again. Not that I would be able to recognize her, since every time I saw her at the window her face was completely black. And that's how my story ends. Thankfully I didn't get to see how she looked like, but I realized my story was not as interesting as some others that I have read. In any case, I hope you enjoyed it, and sorry if some things don't make sense. English isn't my first language. About 10 years ago, I worked for a shop that offered copy and print services. Your standard event flyers, wedding invitations, business cards, etc. We had a regular customer. I'll call him Howard. From my first day working at the shop, I heard about Howard. He was a weird old man who would have his son bring him to the shop about once a week to get copies and poster-sized versions of his projects. Towards the end of my first week, Howard and his son came in as expected. He had a large stack of papers and a handwritten list of instructions for our staff. 50 color copies of this one, blow that one up, and so on. Curiosity got the best of me, so I went behind the counter to eavesdrop. I could feel Howard staring at me, but pretended to work on something so I wouldn't have to engage too much. To my complete shock, and trust me, it takes a lot to shock me, his projects were pictures of women, cut out from magazines and other sources, with X'd and scratched out eyes, red marker, blood, drawn on and coming from various body parts. The C word was scrawled across a lot of them, along with other horrifying things. Sometimes they were naked, from Playboy or something similar, other times they were from a lingerie catalog or celeb magazine. My coworkers looked at Howard as one big joke, and got a kick out of seeing what projects he would bring in next. At one point he asked that some of his copied material be scanned into our computer and transferred to CDs. One of these involved black and white pictures of Natalie Portman with extremely graphic doodles of things being done to her. I called out how wrong it was that we were enabling this sick old man. Most people straight up laughed at me, while others told me that he was good for business. We were not allowed to turn him away, no matter how disgusting his stuff was. I later found out he had been doing this for nearly a decade. One day, his son came in without him to pick up some copies. I asked him if he was concerned or ever said anything to Howard about his projects. He very nonchalantly explained that Howard's room at his senior housing facility was almost completely covered with these pictures and posters. Since it was keeping him busy, both his son and his caregivers left it alone. I made sure to never be anywhere near Howard when he came in. I also ended up quitting a few months later because this place was a toxic nightmare. On my last day, one of my coworkers gifted me one of the CDs of Howard's art. I never fucking looked at it.